But then what happens if you're actually going on a particular recruitment drive? We had an organisation recently that actually bought a different organisation and they merged it in. When they then did their workforce planning, they had a joining rate of 7,000%. Did they change their modelling because they had an anomaly for a year? No. So they were really surprised when they did their workforce planning to find they were going to be hellishly oversupplied the following year because they assumed that they were going to grow by 7,000% again. So yes, there's looking at trend data, but there's actually putting some thought, some analysis behind that says, is that trend going to change going forward? What are we doing to actually impact that trend? And then finally, and probably most importantly, the blue box around forecasting the future establishment. Looking at the demand, what do you think you're actually going to need? And within this, thinking about tying together the workforce, the finance, and the strategy. Many organisations still only do their strategy based on the finance, the money available. They don't get into actually what does that mean from a workforce point of view. So the forecast future establishment should be taking into account the strategy, the direction of the organisation, the money that's actually going to be available, and therefore the workforce that can be afforded. And that gives you your forecast establishment. So at the very, very simple level, workforce planning is about understanding the current organisation, understanding how it's going to move, who's going to join, who's going to leave, and then what actually do we need, either in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15, whatever that time frame is. And then you'll get to a point where you'll potentially have a workforce gap. And then that is the strategy. How do we close that workforce gap? Now, that may be at a full organisational level. It may be if you drill down into, say, the upstream piece, and then within that, within the exploration, what's the gap going to be there? And actually, if you move it forward, you may find in some areas of the group, you'll actually have an oversupply. And then the challenge becomes, well, what do we do with that oversupply? Do we retrain them and move them to different parts of the organisation? Are we finding that we now have a skill set within the organisation we no longer need? And what's the feedback loop with that? Are you ensuring that you're not then recruiting that group and actually growing that gap year on year? I do quite a lot of work within the health sector. And we saw a piece recently where they were training more doctors in a 3 to 7 year training program. And we put them in, and you have this pipeline of people going through university. By the time they came out of university, their job was redundant because technology had overtaken the need for that resource. And then you actually look back, and when the commission was taken to educate those people, the technology was known, but the two hadn't been linked. And I think within the oil sector, there is that piece in. Actually, what does it look like in 3, 5, 10 years' time? You build in, you bring in an existing skill set now, but will you need them in 3 years' time? Will you need them in 5 years' time? What's technology doing? Linda touched on the growth strategy you have. Where are you going to need those people? Are you recruiting people who are particularly mobile to go to the new areas where you want to go to? There's a real danger that organisations that want to grow very quickly get to a point of having an over workforce supply, because they've not necessarily recruited the people they need for their next phase of their strategy. What I'm conscious of when we give these presentations is that we quite often stand at the front and we preach around how workforce planning should be done. And we make it sound like every other organisation in the world is doing workforce planning brilliantly, and this is the only organisation that isn't. That's absolutely not the case. What we tend to see with workforce planning is actually it's a relatively new occurrence for people to do across the whole organisation. There are pockets where it's being done well. There are probably pockets within this group where it's being done well. And what we want to do is draw on that best practice and build that and work out why it's working well in particular industries or within particular areas of the group. This is a very, very simple model to say the different sorts of things we mean when we talk about workforce planning, quite often called manpower planning at the bottom 2 levels. So there is just the simple analytics. If we take the workforce as it is now, we take the trends for the last couple of years, and we extrapolate that over the next couple of years, that is a form of workforce planning. I wouldn't say it's particularly strategic or particularly scientific, but it's based on fact. There's then a second level that says, okay, well, let's build into that actually what we may need. Let's start to add that demand and build in that kind of little bit more science around, okay, if that's what we've done previously and this is what we need, we're now at kind of a resource forecasting level. Then you can start to say, okay, what are the skills, and get into the talent needs. And you add that next level of complexity to it, before the final bit where you can actually do some modelling and do some scenario planning. Well, what happens if we do this? What happens actually if our strategy changes? And build in different scenarios. What happens if the market changes? The global recession has significantly changed the workforce resource pool. Generally, within a recession, we see less people leaving the organisation. There's been less of a flow. What we're now seeing is a relatively fluid resource pool. People have kind of come out of the 1-2 years of kind of hanging on to the jobs they got, and now they're looking around. Actually, now is a really, really good time to be an employer going out to try to bring people into their organisation. So how do you model that scenario? What happens if we suddenly get an influx of people now? How do we build that into our culture of the organisation, and how does that roll forward in future years? In terms of industries comparing, we look at it in two real ways. One, the demand management. How good are organisations at working out what demand they're going to need? And that's about understanding their strategy, working out if we expand like this, what sort of demand will we need going forward. And then supply management. You can actually control your supply. There is a piece, if you look at some organisation, they're very good at linking into universities, and they get that first pick of graduates. And some people manage their supply by paying more. So the retail market is very good both in demand and supply. Banking are very good at understanding their workforce, who makes money for them. They really understand what sort of person that is. If any of you have ever gone into a banking sector and looked at their kind of recruitment, they're very good at profiling the sort of individuals they want, and they understand their demand very well. Their supply is very much managed by paying a lot of money, but also getting the graduates early. So they're kind of in that middle bit. The reason we put consulting up there on the kind of left-hand side, you may be surprised seeing as I'm a consultant standing here and we can't get it right, is that, again, we are very good at managing our supply. We get a lot of graduates in. As an organisation, we're quite appealing. Linda talked about the oil industry, not necessarily being the sort of industry that people kind of, when they're 12, 13, 14, kind of, they're thinking, oh, I really want to do that. Having said that, not many people 12, 13, 14 are saying they want to be accountants. But the consulting industry has a certain appeal to people. However, from a demand point of view, consulting is quite difficult to work out what sort of demand you're going to need, because at the end of the day, it's reliant on us selling our business and then having the people to staff it. Again, in the UK, as I was flying out yesterday, PwC have announced they want to hire 1,000 consultants. And from a workforce planning point of view, I would love to see the numbers that worked out that they needed 1,000 people, because my guess is it's based around a strategy of growth. Now, whether you can actually realise that growth by selling into the market is a different scenario. But the 1,000 is something they can probably manage from a supply point of view, but is the demand really understood? So that's why we put consulting on the left-hand side. In terms of oil companies, I think it's an interesting area. Again, Exxon, BP, Shell have probably been looking at this for a couple of years in specific areas, normally triggered by a lack of supply, a real not enough